Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today at the United Nations Association, and thank you for all the work that you do for the world and for the people of our world, and today in celebrating human rights. I think I'll begin by saying, since we're talking about rights, that the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WECAN, is dedicated to four main principles, which is women's rights, indigenous rights, the rights of nature, and the rights of future generations. And when I was first dreaming of the organization, I knew I wanted to have a rights-based organization so that we could really work both at a cultural level but also a legal level to change how we're living with each other on the earth. So women's rights, indigenous rights, rights of nature, and rights of future generations are really the unheard voices that have really brought about the imbalance that we're seeing on our earth right now. And we feel that by uplifting those four voices, those rights, we can really make a paradigm shift, which we desperately need at this time. So I'm going to jump right in because the time is short, and I want to get to some really key points that are, I think, very significant in response to the question that was asked of us. A few things. One, I do think it's very important, we don't have time to go into it in detail today, to understand the deep significance that women have in changing the trajectory we're in. We know that women are the most negatively impacted by climate change and environmental degradation because of the lack of rights in many cases, lack of education, lack of resources, lack of economic equity. I could go on. But we also know they're key to solutions. And around the world, women are always telling me in our network, we work in many countries around the world, we are not victims, we are solutions. And they are absolutely right, because when we look at everything from food security and food sovereignty to water issues to energy issues, women are on the front lines and at the forefront of transforming the societies that we're in. 60 to 80% of all household food production in developing countries is done by women. UN studies, after many others, show that if you don't involve women in water projects, they simply don't work because women are doing the water collecting and have the local water knowledge. And we also see trends in the sense that climate change and environmental degradation are these huge issues which are just very daunting to look at. And so we often look at a lot of top-down measures to resolve them. That's very key and important. But we also need to understand that these small-scale local solutions, local economy, local food sheds, local watershed are absolutely essential to real solutions that are long-term and long-lasting in communities. And to be sure, women are at the forefront of leading those operations, and they have the social capital to do so. So I just wanted to lay a little bit of a framework. What I want to jump into, and I'm so glad that I followed you, Professor, because one of our biggest focuses all along has been on Indigenous women and Indigenous rights. And we're seeing this very, very strongly, both at the UN climate talks as well as a lot of the resistance movements around the world. And I do want to say that I've been incredibly honored since this summer. I've been up in North Dakota at Standing Rock 3 different times to support our allies on the ground. We also did a very in-depth study and analysis on 15 Indigenous women leaders to show the incredible work that they're doing to give voice in the media to Indigenous women leaders, and also to show that, as many people in the council will tell you, women are the backbone of this movement, Indigenous women. And I think it's important to say, here we are on Human Rights Day, that the voices of everyone up at Standing Rock is incredible. But today I want to speak about the women and the dignity and wisdom that they have brought to keep this a peaceful and prayerful protest has been paramount. The force of the women there and how they have operated, both from the youth who started the movement up in Standing Rock to the elders. We have seen, in terms of human rights abuses, attacks by dogs, mace, pepper spray, women and men both being strip searched for misdemeanors when they were arrested. We're talking about something so outrageous, it is hard for me to believe that I'm talking about my own country. It is so outrageous, the treatment that people have had there. Water cannons being sprayed on water protectors in freezing degrees that led to hypothermia. One woman has almost lost her arm. Another Indigenous woman has lost sight in one eye because of the rubber bullets. This is from peaceful, prayerful people who are trying to protect their water, not just for their own communities, for millions of others. And I want to reiterate that I think that, as was already spoken about, that one of the things that has deeply moved me in the last year since I've been involved in work around climate change and protection of our biodiversity of our planet is how much we see Indigenous people on the front lines of these battles and struggles, and how much they're putting their bodies on the line to protect their lifeways, to protect the water, to protect the land, and also for all of us. And I really believe that one of the things that we can do, and it was asked earlier, what can we do? I think one of the things that we can do more than anything else is to stand by our sisters and brothers and fight for Indigenous rights and the territories that they're protecting. 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth is in Indigenous lands. So it behooves all of us to understand what we're talking about as we face climate impacts and the need to protect water, air, forests, and land for everyone, is who's on the front lines and who's protecting those lifeways and ways of managing their forests over all these thousands of years as Indigenous people, and what can we do to ally with them to support their leadership and to support their worldview and to support the rights that they're fighting for. Women around the world on the front of Indigenous fights are telling us that colonization must end, sacrifice zones, and environmental racism must end. So what we're also seeing in terms of human rights abuses is the fact of environmental racism around the world, where a lot of pipelines are, oil refineries, bomb trains transporting oil, is often impacting frontline communities. They're not only Indigenous communities, but also people of color. And we need to also look at this and understand there's a component of environmental racism that we absolutely must address. We're also seeing the desecration of Indigenous sacred sites and these violations of Indigenous lands and complete disrespect for the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the right to free, prior, informed consent. These are things and tools and mechanisms that we have that we can actually step in and do something to protect these rights for Indigenous peoples. I also had the honor earlier this year to go to Ecuador, where some of the women that we're working with are fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador. And there was an amazing march that they organized around International Women's Day in March, which had 500 Indigenous women from all over the jungle come to protest in the town of Puyo, a small jungle town. And it was really phenomenal because these women, you know, they canoed for 5 days, they walked through the jungle with their babies on their backs. Just the effort to get 500 women from jungle territories to be in one location in March was incredibly exhilarating and powerful. And they're saying, we do not want any more fossil fuel extraction in our territories, and we want the international community to support us. And this is very important because they are fighting their own government and corporations who are bringing fossil fuel into their territories, extraction into their territories, and many of them are being criminalized for standing up to stop the destruction of their territories. So we need to understand also, similar to what we're seeing here at Standing Rock, similar to seeing in Ecuador, similar to many of the women that we work with around the world, that as we see activists get out on the street, or water protectors, or land protectors, land defenders stand up, the criminalization of these land defenders is also increasing, and I consider this a severe human rights violation. Amen. And so let's not forget Berta Cáceres from Honduras, a very powerful Indigenous woman leader from Honduras who worked for years to protect her riverways from big mega dams, who received many death threats. She was also a high-level environmental activist as well as an award winner, and she was murdered. Some of you may know that. She was murdered for her work. And so big question for me when we're working with a lot of the women on the front lines around the world is, you know, how do we protect a lot of these land defenders? How can we say that we're going to protect the land if we cannot protect the defenders of the land? And I think this is a very deep question for us on Human Rights Day. Again, I mentioned that a lot of these women and men both are putting their bodies on the line for all of us. And where do we stand? And I know for myself very personally, I have really had it with black and brown bodies being on the line for our birth. And I think it's a question we need to really address. Not that everyone needs to go to this degree, but earlier this autumn, along with several other colleagues, we were arrested and in Washington, D.C. at the Department of the Interior in a solidarity action for Standing Rock, as well as to protest the continued renewal of fossil fuel extraction on public lands in the United States, both land and water. And we were going there to speak to the administration and say, you know, we do not want the Dakota Access Pipeline, we want protection of Indigenous sovereignty in this country, and we also want to stop all fossil fuel extraction in the United States, no more new fossil fuel leases. I do think it's a time we need to accelerate what we're willing to risk. And again, I'm not suggesting everyone needs to be involved in nonviolent civil disobedience. I'm not suggesting everyone needs to get arrested. But I do bring forward today, as we see this new administration coming in, with the new head of the EPA, with the new Secretary of State potentially, with a list that has gone out that the Trump transition team is looking at, asking to see who is at climate talks. They want a list so that they know who they need to remove from the administration going forward. I do think we need to ask ourselves at this moment, with the small amount of time we have in combating climate change, in this level of biodiversity loss, in the loss of human life already from climate change around the world, what are we willing to risk? And it's a very personal question. Where do we stand? We are way out of academics now. We are way out of the UN climate talks, moving numbers around. Though I go every year now, and I'm very dedicated to our work to fight for gender equality, to fight for rights of nature, to fight for Indigenous rights, to fight for human rights in those spaces, and we will continue to bring delegations that are frontline women to speak for themselves. I'm very much engaged in that process as much as we can, and many other women's organizations who do enormous work there. But I also know we are out of time, and so here on Human Rights Day, we need to ask ourselves, what are we willing to risk for our human sisters and brothers around the world who are on the front lines for all of us, and to really address at a very deep level, how do we go forward? Okay, I'm running out of time here. I do want to mention, just to bring in some facts here for people's further addressing of these issues, that Global Witness is a really great organization. We reported last year that over 185 land defenders and environmental activists were killed around the world. 40% of them, it should be noted, were Indigenous peoples. And I think that the violence against defenders of the land is on the rise. And we're really seeing this. And I want to make the link sort of in my final moment here. I could go on and on, and I was going to say actually some good things about the climate negotiations in Marrakesh. We just came out with a full report of our assessment. You can go onto our website and find that, since I sort of ran out of time. But we did actually find some points of entry where there can be some negotiations around gender equality, around openings, around traditional ecological knowledge for Indigenous peoples that can be brought into some of the work there. But I think fundamentally we need to look at the fact that we're on this extractive economy. We've got to keep all the fossil fuels in the ground, our scientists are telling us. Oil Change just came out with, and Oil Change International came out with an incredible report. I would suggest people look at it, that basically says we cannot drill one more drop. We have used up our carbon budget. So we need to look at these facts and understand, how do we make this transition off of an extractive economy into a new economy? How do we move to respect Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous rights? And how do we lift up women who are really at the forefront of so many of these struggles? And these are just some of the things I propose to you to look at on Human Rights Day. Thanks so much.